I'm very lucky. Peter Meltrick came out a few weeks ago to the farm. It could be said I'm very, very lucky because I've got a farm to play with. But it's very, very, very serious play. I work for the Wildlife Trust, Worcestershire Wildlife Trust. Lower Smite Farm is 65 hectares. We have 70 nature reserves in the county, and we're one of the largest landowners in the county. We have nearly 1,000 hectares, and we're buying more. Fundamentally, the safest place for wildlife to be is on the land that we own. But it means we have to put our money where our mouth is, because we have to work with land managers and influence them. So one of the reasons I'm practically hoarse is I've been so busy picking up ideas from all of you here that I take those ideas and hopefully not like a loose cannon, head off out to the farming community, telling them the most exciting things that have happened here to get farmers to implement that and consider implementing it on their farms. So a little picture of the farm here. The first thing is, and we've heard this theme running through the conference, we don't look in the farm in isolation. Either from cropping or from the wildlife point of view. So you don't need to remember all the crops that are on there. We have a mosaic of enterprises. And as a farmer recently said to me, he said, "Dear, people are laughing at you a lot less now on the farm." I said, "They are? That's really nice to know. What's that?" He said, "Well, it's beginning to look like a proper farm in there." We've got the 1918 diaries, and by that, what he means basically is we're a mixed, extensive arable farm. When I took the farm on, we were conventional. We were certainly not getting the 3.5 tonnes to the acre and £160 a tonne that would be needed to justify staying conventional. We didn't want to go out to contractors, and our wildlife was experiencing what many of you are experiencing, national declines, which impact on you and your own enterprises, regardless of what you perhaps are trying to do. The barn owl is symbolic because it comes from the neighbour's farm to us, and the barn owl, their chick brood size is totally dependent on the number of small mammals that they can eat. And small mammals was one of the key features that helped me persuade the trust for us to go organic, because we get far more small mammals further out in the field than we would do with conventional agriculture. So that was the starting point. This picture is from the Institute of European Environmental Policy, David Baldock's, one of his papers. And what I'm just trying to capture here is the farm on the bottom here is a very intensive farm with very little habitat. And the chances are its soil is also, as someone said to me a few weeks ago, it's probably inert. And when I was agronomising in the Cotswolds, one of the things I used to sort of rather off the tongue say was, "Oh, it's dead easy. There's nothing in this soil. It's like hydroponics. You know how much fertiliser you add. You know where it's going to go. You just go like this, that it's not going to get too much rain and it's going to run down." So we could pretty much gauge the input in terms of chemicals and, to crop yield. We use agri-environment schemes to add to the infrastructure on the farm so that we've got more hedges, more diverse grassland, more diversity basically. Higher nature value farming is something some of you may have heard a bit about. It's coming in slowly because it's not understood very well, but if you're interested in feeding back to the DEFRA survey at the moment as to what we should be investing our modulation money in, higher nature value farming is one of those things. People are already doing it in the Lizard Peninsula, they're already doing it in the Cotswolds, they're already doing it on the Wiltshire Downs where they've got species-rich grass. But basically you're looking at farms with a lot of diversity, but particularly mature habitats, not just new habitats. So one of the things we did immediately was to add habitat to the farm. So I'm happy to say we maxed up on every agri-environment scheme there is possible, which causes me a lot of loss of sleep at the moment, making sure that I'm not in breach of anything on the farm. And a core element was to have year-round food supply and habitat whilst identifying what we could do to be commercially viable. Our soil is a Hindlip series. It's a silty loam over clay. People often come onto the farm and say, "You're lucky you've got a clay." It's not a clay, it's a silty loam with a very high magnesium. It's very tight. This kind of ground doesn't tell you it's going ouch until you come through the cultivations. You can drive over it, you won't get deep ruts, but boy, you can have cultivation, or you can have compaction. And that compaction squeezes all the air out of the ground and then sets us back on all the experiments that I'm getting a lovely pot of money to spend on. pH is around neutral. We don't lime. We don't apply phosphate. So again, you could say I'm lucky, but I believe if we're getting the mycorrhiza content right in the soil, that we can survive with phosphate levels of 1.5 to 2. Are you hearing me okay out there? Yeah. So the soil organic matters as a starting point, we're averaging 2.5%. Phosphate 0 to 2, don't care. Where the phosphates were 0, we put on creating species-rich grass and higher level stewardship. I'll come on to that later about adding value onto that. Potash minimum 2, magnesium is very high, which is why the ground is so tight. Cation exchange capacity is generally high. So basically, it's a good soil. It takes a long time to warm up in the spring. It holds moisture, it caps, which is why I don't like spring cropping too much, apart from the impacts on wildlife. But it's a good soil. Once it warms up and gets going, it's very productive. Just for a second, reflect back on the last time you had to stop your car to wipe the windscreen clean of insect smear in this country. 10 years. I figure some of the younger people might not even have ever had to do it in there. And that would be the peak of throwing everything at the book and trying to get 12 tonne per hectare crops. That's the insecticides. It's loss of habitat, yes, there's never just one factor, but that's loss of habitat, and that habitat is the soil. And that's the insecticides and slug pellets that were applied on farm. I remember one of the first times I walked across a field that methiacarb had been applied on. I won't say the names. Methiacarb is an active ingredient. And there was just a mass of dead earthworms on the soil surface. Don't worry, I was told. It can manage without the earthworms. But the lapwing can't manage without the earthworms on the farm. Now, I've just shown this picture. We have a lot of slowworm in Worcestershire. Slowworm eats slugs. If the slug eats slug pellets, the slowworm dies. The slowworm is a protected species. Rooks, we don't mind the rooks. They come down and they'll eat leather jackets on the farm. What I mind is when these products, farmers don't get the information on the neonicotinoids and the slug pellet dressings that you can get on maize, that the farmers aren't getting the information. So guys talk about information provision on the farm. They're not being, they might be getting told there's environment information sheets, but they're certainly not downloading them and reading them. If you want to make your hair stand on end, download the environment information sheet for ready go to tear, and download an environment information sheet for a slug pellet dressing on maize. It will tell you quite categorically they're highly toxic to various forms of wildlife, corvids, game birds, and anything that eats them. So rather blasely, let's just make sure there's no seed on the soil surface. I don't think so. Who can drill without actually getting any seed on the soil surface? And many of these creatures will dig down and eat the germinating seed. So the greatest problem that we've got with our soil is the loss of soil wildlife. So what we're doing is basically I glean as much as I can off events like this. I speak to as many people as possible. I have a budget, which is not too extreme a budget, actually. And I was reminded, I was talking to someone earlier about a film with, I think it was Dave Stewart, an old film about a chap who had £1 million to spend, and he had to spend it in order to be able to keep the £1 million, but he couldn't give it away. But every time he spent it on lost losers, those lost losers, just by sod's law, started making money. And this is what I found like my budget. I spend it, and then actually I start getting forage that I wasn't anticipating. So when people start saying to you, well, you're not producing a crop, I go, well, actually, I wasn't going into it thinking we were going to produce a crop. I was just going into it to see what the impact of lucerne and sainfoin, etc., would be on the soil. But then the neighbour started saying, like Rob was talking about the drought, saying, as the dairy cows next door were all hanging over the fence into our ground, because there was nothing left on theirs, he said, well, we could cut that for you. So we now work with 3 neighbours, one who does the heavier machine work, one who comes in and cuts the forage for us, and one who provides us with livestock. That neighbour actually also comes from Wales. It's an organic farm in Wales. I've stuck in skylark because we have to be very careful with how we cut ground nesting skylark. People will often say we've got lots of skylark, and I'll go, have you, particularly when it's winter crops. If you hear a lot of skylark singing in June, the chances are it's because you haven't got lots of skylark. The chances are it's because it's the male still looking for a female. And it's really important in conventional winter cereals, particularly where it's intensive winter cereals, that you get the second brood to keep skylark numbers going, and so you can get an increase in the species. I've mentioned small mammals. We know for sure that small mammals go right out into the field. This means when you do cut, there are casualties. But we do try to cut when they're not active. So we try to time our activities to when the wildlife isn't fully active. But when there are casualties, one bonus can be, last week we had red kite coming over. We see that as a bonus. We will see buzzards coming down in. Most of the time the buzzards are coming in is for another reason, which I'll come into. So we cut, for example, a clover mix. This is Persian clover, crimson clover, and mustard mix. Sometimes I really wonder why we put mustard in, because we have more charlock than anyone else on the planet on the farm. But basically, I look on charlock now, it's a green manure. Just don't let it seed. So we're not buying the mustard anymore. But I showed this because of the interconnection, is that we get honeybees and bumblebees feeding on these mixes. We've counted bumblebees on Phacelia. We can have up to 15,000 bumblebees per hectare. In fact, Phacelia will pinch them from the other crops that are out there as well. In the summer quick fix mix, when there's no Phacelia, and our volunteers go out and they stick their arms out like this. We do it scientifically. They walk down and they count bumblebees, not bumblebees that are turning back, only bumblebees that they can clearly see. So we're seriously underestimating the amount of invertebrates that are in here, and we're not counting honeybees. But we can easily get 8,000 to 10,000 bumblebees per hectare being supported on these. Now, a crucial thing is that we also have rare arable flora. We need the rare arable flora because they often release their nectar at night. Often these clover species are releasing their nectar during the day. So our night feeders, like bats, need to be coming out. So our cornflowers, our corn buttercups, our mouse ears, they release their nectar at night. So that's night feeding invertebrates. And so we're wanting to have the whole cycle of nectar throughout the day as well as throughout the year as much as possible. This is 6-month-old San Juan. How am I doing for time? Okay, 6-month-old San Juan. The key thing here is the size of the root nodules. We went into very poor ground. You can see there was compaction. We did the heinous thing and ploughed when it was too wet, and we suffered for it. But anyway, so we've sowed in these cover crops to see how they would cope with it. So this is San Juan that was dug up 2 or 3 weeks ago. I sent this off to Cotswold Seeds, and basically the soil is falling apart around these root nodules. It's fascinating to see. And just as a by-the-by, when we were doing the earthworm counts, we figured we had about 750,000 rove beetle per hectare on the San Juan plots. We're overseeding because basically we feel 4 years isn't enough of an in-conversion period for us, or in general we're going to 8 years. I know you don't necessarily have the luxury of that, but 2 years we've been talking nutrient levels and things for many conventional farmers are already down there. We've done a compost trial with green waste. I've put in grass snake there. You can see all the activity that's been happening in the compost pile. But I think the key thing is this compost was great. We've piled it on. It's 20 tonnes per hectare. It's taken the pH up to 7.5. I'm not recommending you do this at home, but it did a very good job on the cooch. The cooch doesn't like being limed. And it also did a very good job on the red clover, which disappeared. Competition. All these creatures have one thing in common, and if this is my last slide, what's the thing they have in common? They all eat worms, thank you very much. They all eat earthworms. Most buzzards are eating earthworms. A fox's diet, 34% of it is earthworms. Just a quick bit on the earthworm counts here. We do earthworm counts. This is an organic 2-year-old ryegrass clover mix. This is the same mix with compost. We get about a 4-fold increase in earthworms just after 1 year. Earthworms also like sex. The trouble is, if you've got conventional land, you have very low numbers of earthworms. They're forced into hermaphroditic behaviour. That also means things like lapwings that are feeding on them have to leave their chicks for longer in order to get food, so they become much more vulnerable to predation. Okay, I'll shoot through this. We look at bacteria and fungi. Basically, this is a failing catchment. All the soils are bacterial dominant and have no nematodes. That's because it's got compaction, it's got no organic matter, and they need compost, and they need to start looking at the way that they apply phosphate to the ground. This farmer is fantastic. He has, we decided last year, looking at the soil on here, do we muddle in a winter wheat in any time from November? We costed it. No, because we can't get 3.5 tonnes, and the price was only £120 a tonne. So there was no point in doing it. Okay, do we do it in anaerobic conditions with a spring wheat? No, we costed it. Well, what could we do? Because we've heard photosynthesis is important. Well, I don't like bare ground anywhere. So he, who has been, because you might watch this video one day, he has basically is inspiring with the way he has cherry-picked from what we're doing at the farm. And our ground often starts out looking very messy. when you put new mix in, but boy, with a bit of management, they come around. So rather than follow the conventional route, and a lot of farmers last year were going out and buying ploughs, losing their confidence with their minimal tillage and going, well, we'll dry the ground out. Nitrous oxide, phosphate loss, loss of earthworms, loss of your organic matter and everything else, don't do it. So also don't necessarily let your cover crop get to this stage. We just didn't have the heart to let it go in this field. We're not talking about letting mustard get to the point where it self-seeds in your field. But he's basically picked the best from organic, I'm nearly there, and he's applied it to his farming system. And that includes hopefully going to Richard Steele's later in the year to see how they're managing a totally organic. My mission is to convert this man to organic. By all by his own bat, what he's done is in our tired clover ryegrass mixes, he's thrown in various flowers. This is because he's dropped the neonicotinoid on his winter wheat seed dressing. He doesn't have to, but he has. And so we're attracting it. And we can just see, we don't know quite how it's working, but even 2 weeks ago, we could see huge numbers of parasitic wasps and hoverflies visiting I've forgotten the name of the flower now, Cosmos, that's in here. So he's also created a functioning wetland. And by that means the ground coming off the neighbours is coming into his field. He's blocked his drains. Big thing, most of our pesticides go in the water through the field drains. And boy, there are pesticides in the water. And within 3 months, we had lapwing on the field. Last slide. So basically, with the Worcestershire Wildlife Trust, our mission is to have organic, wildlife-friendly farming between all our nature's reserves. And the final thing that we've done is with the grazier, we're endorsing the way that they farm by saying approved by Worcestershire Wildlife Trust, basically, on their beef box scheme. So we're hoping to help graziers and producers add further value to their product as well. Thank you very much.